Well, good morning. I am so excited to be here today, and I want to thank you all so much for inviting me. Nothing can be more of an honor than to start your day by thanking the backbone of America, which are women who breastfeed their children. I say to this and come to this conversation not as a person who's observant from studies or from research. I say this as a father of two young boys who were breastfed by my wife. But more distinctly and more importantly, I say this as a person who is deeply committed to the idea that we can start by addressing issues around health disparities at the very beginning of life. And if we are to be committed to this conversation, then the start is where we have to be, not somewhere along the way. Oftentimes we find, if you will, our policy solutions, our programmatic engagements, or even our intellectual curiosity often starts at the bend of life versus at the beginning. In many respects, I find it also ironic that today is the day, 22 years ago, by a gentleman by the name of Marvin Gaye died. And in many respects, as I'm much older than I look, as a product of Marvin Gaye, both from conception and also from enjoyment, there's a lot of y'all who are, I'll just leave it at that. So in many respects, but the reason why I bring this up is because Marvin Gaye had a number of songs, and I am so grateful that he made one song that makes me want to holler. Because in many respects today, as we listen to our political conversations around what it means to be healthy, what it means to be treated right, what it means to be treated equitably, and how do we create a just society, oftentimes the conversation that we find ourselves listening to on TV makes one want to holler. But more importantly, I think in many respects, as we start to think about these dynamics and how we bring these issues together, I'm also reminded, too, that in much of the way in which we communicate both our passion and our concerns is through the utility of music, not because of its melodic or syncopated elements, but more so because of its healing utility that it brings. That oftentimes that for those of us who had those grandmothers who used to sing those hymnals from time to time again, or used to hum, if you will, from time to time again, that was a healing method, if you will, both for her and also for the grandchildren that she was holding. So in many respects, this conversation is as much as it's about you, it really isn't. It really is about how we can move the next generation forward. How do we ensure, in many respects, that we don't have issues of gaps that consistently continue, as the great Secretary Margaret Heckler said in 1985, when she spoke very specifically about these stubborn disparities that if they are not addressed, they will create a permanent health underclass. And if one was to look at the statistics today, if we were to look at the rate ratios of white baby to black baby deaths, in many respects, we are staring, if you will, at a reality of almost a permanent public health underclass. Now, we have great joy to think about. We have great ideas and great conversations that we're having today because to a certain degree, there was a health care law that was passed that said that we should amend the Fair Labor Standards Act and we should amend, if you will, the Treatment Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and also the treatment, if you will, of mothers who want to be able to care for their children. And as groundbreaking as that was, as motivating as that was, as engaging as that was, just the idea of having a place to go and be able to pump in private that could be locked, we find ourselves, if you will, still with the lack of protection around those provisions. For all intents and purposes, recently and more directly, cases have been brought up, if you will, looking at issues around discrimination where women have said that they have not been, if you will, afforded the proper number of hours to allow for pumping, that they have not been afforded, if you will, the proper space and place to allow for those things to take place. They have not been giving, if you will, a sense of clarity and direction from their employers on exactly how and what their rights are in reference to their ability to take care of their children. And unfortunately, as court case has happened, it has been reified that there really isn't as much protection as one may have thought. So in many respects, as I think about where we go as a foundation in relation to policy and communications, it is much about connecting people to policy and policy to people. For those of us who spend a large amount of time in Washington, we all recognize the reality that if you're not specific about what you ask for, you will get something that you didn't anticipate, right? And so when I was a young man and I was on the Hill, and they used to say, well, you know, AJ, we want to go to the Hill, and we want them to do something. I said, please be specific. Because let us be clear, if you bring to Congress a dove and you say you want something a little bit better, they will give you a dog and say, well, both of them are breathing and have function. But that's not what you anticipated, right? So in many respects, as a foundation, we have to be very thoughtful about how we think about the way in which policies are designed, how they are articulated in communities to make sure that they're not only touching with the issues that are in the communities, but that they also are elevating, if you will, the concerns of the community in a very thoughtful way. It is, in many respects, thinking about how do we platform the reality of everyday people's lives. I was humbled and remiss and reminded, as my colleague who spoke earlier before me raised W.E.B. Du Bois as a conversation. I know that some of y'all are on the other side of the track, so Du Bois for those. But for folks like myself from the South, we say Du Bois or boys and those kind of things to make sure you know what I'm talking about. But what was interesting was the first conversation actually to be raised about the treatment of the way in which motherhood and fatherhood which should be addressed was actually in 1889, the Philadelphia Negro, in the study that W.E.B. Du Bois did, where he laid out, if you will, if you're going to make substantial progress looking at these street blocks, that one has to think about the very fabric and the conception of what it means to be family and the raising of children in those structures. So what I'm saying is we are coming to this conversation in a very, very long engagement. But what I'm also reminded about is if you go back into that particular chapter, into that particular book, in the last chapter, he says the final word, right? And that's usually for most of us when we all kind of lean in and listen, when somebody says, let me give you a final word. But he starts out by saying that some will say, why, my goodness, the problem is too complex, it's too overwhelming, there's nothing we can do, and there you have it. And he says, and another camp would say, my friend, if you just applied this policy or that policy long enough, that things will change, and that's all we need to do. And he ends by saying, actually, it's a mix of both. That to appreciate the complexity of the problems that we deal with today, we have to detangle the conversation and apply, if you will, methods of approach to each one over a particular period of time. Now, that's hard to do in a truncated conversation when political races are usually won and given, if you will, in 1 year to the next. That is also hard to do in a society that Martin Luther King called only had the memory of 10 minutes. After John F. Kennedy was shot, he said that this is a 10-minute nation. And that at some point we'll feel the need to move forward and move on and get back to our sitcoms and our day-to-day realities, our day-to-day lives. So how do we keep, if you will, the focus and the direction on issues of children? And that has been the bend, if you will, the foundation for a whole. And as we think specifically about communications, I want to back up a little bit and really speak about what this really gets to. Oftentimes for communities, particularly communities in which I come from, communities which many of you work in and come from too as well, we have been spoken to and not spoken with. And thank you. And so oftentimes, as we think about the importance, if you will, around breastfeeding, the question is, can we have a conversation with mothers and not to mothers? In many respects, the way in which we even platformed the legislation that was done, as thankful as it was, it left out huge swaths of conversations. What do I mean by this? As many of you know, organizations that are under what they call small, medium enterprises, or SMEs, 50 employees or less, are effectively left without the need to have to even engage in this conversation. Now, why is that problematic? For those of you all who are sociologists and those of you all who study economics, you will know that the black middle class, 46% of us are actually employed in SMEs. So if you leave that structure out, what you are saying is that for the upwardly socially mobile, that they are not able to actually have a structured conversation with their employer in a very directed way in terms of how they can be able to make sure that they take care of the children in which they rear and raise. Or more importantly, as we think more specifically globally, I know there was a conversation that was had earlier on what's happening on the national stage. We do appreciate the fact that we still have 45 countries who do not have any standing policy or law or provision, if you will, that deals with breastfeeding at all. And if you were to go from the 182 countries that are recognized by the United Nations, 111 of them have policy, but those policies are patchworked and for all intents and purposes are not harmonized, if you will, in many respects. So depending on what country you are in, or more importantly, what dynamics, if you will, the employment of that country is, you don't have an appreciation for that. Or more importantly, and more specifically, if we are to think about the ways in which discrimination takes root, particularly for women, it is often in the labor market. And if the labor market is to be adjusted in such a way to allow for women not to just take care of their children, but more importantly for women to be able to actually aspire and rise to the highest levels in the workplace, then this idea around breastfeeding and this idea around allowing for safe spaces, if you will, to take care of children is not a thing to help the child alone, it's a thing to advance the mother as a collective. And that, my friend, is thinking very differently about how we relate the conversation around law, policy, and communication, and the role and responsibility, if you will, around funding. And that gets to philanthropy. For many respects, philanthropy has a very unique role in this. I often, going back to Du Bois for a second, think of philanthropy as having a gift of second sight, as Du Bois would say, of having that veil to be able to see between two worlds. A world that is and the world that could be. And the question is how well will we design the thought processes in which we fund? Well, that will depend on how well we engage the communities in our funding conversations. So as we have these conversations today, as we engage on what direction policy should go today, I want to offer myself, the team in which we work with in the foundation, but more importantly, all of you, an opportunity to engage us in not the conversation that we're used to having, which is that between grantor and grantee, but more between partner and partner. Because for all intents and purposes, our ability to partner is going to be our future in the way in which we address the issues for children today. With that being said, I thank you so much. Look forward to your comments, queries, and criticisms, but more importantly, I look forward to seeing you at my doorstep in Battle Creek, Michigan, okay? All right. Thank you.